Stealing from the Alpha King was supposed to be a suicide mission, but the price for my life is far more dangerous than death. He doesn't want his crown back, he wants me bound to him forever. To save my people from extinction, I must survive a throne room of shadows. The air in the vault smelled of ancient dust and the metallic tang of impending rain. Arvesa's fingers trembled as they closed around the cool, jagged gold of the crown. It pulsed, a heartbeat that wasn't hers. Behind her, the shadows didn't just move, they breathed. A low vibrational growl rattled her bones before she even turned to see the massive russet-furred beast blocking the moonlight. Torvian Night Rain didn't strike. He shifted, the beast receding into a man of terrifying elegance and obsidian eyes. "Keep it," he whispered, his voice a velvet trap. "But if you take the gold, you take the king who wears it." Arvesa's breath hitched, the weight of the artifact suddenly feeling like a collar. Torvian stepped closer, the heat of his body cutting through the damp chill of the stone chamber. He didn't reach for the stolen treasure. Instead, his gaze tracked the pulse jumping in her throat. In that suffocating silence, the bargain was struck. She had come for a relic to save a starving pack, but she had unwittingly summoned a master who intended to keep her as the crown's permanent shadow. The rain over the Iron Ridge did not fall. It wept, a relentless gray shroud that blurred the jagged silhouette of the Night Rain citadel. High above the churning black waters of the Abyssal Strait, the fortress clung to the cliffs like a predator's claw. Inside those walls sat the hoard of the Alpha King, a treasury said to contain enough ancient magic to mend a broken world or shatter a defiant one. For Arvesa Moonthorn, the citadel was not a marvel of architecture. It was a tomb she was breaking into. Her breath came in shallow, controlled bursts, barely misting in the freezing air of the ventilation shafts. Every muscle in her lithe frame ached, her skin slick with the grime of the tunnels and the cold sweat of a woman who knew she was walking toward her own execution. She moved with the silent, fluid grace of a creature born to the shadows, a skill honed by years of scavenging in the ruins of her ancestral lands. But this was no ruined village. This was the heart of the wolf. As she pressed her cheek against the cold stone, Arvesa allowed herself a single fleeting thought of home. The image burned in her mind's eye, more painful than the jagged rock cutting into her palms. She saw the hollowed-out eyes of the Moonthorn children, their ribs tracing sharp lines against skin that had forgotten the warmth of a full belly. She saw her father, once a proud warrior of the pack, now reduced to a shivering ghost by the hearth, coughing up the gray dust of the blighted lands they had been relegated to. The Moonthorns were not just starving, they were fading out of existence, a lineage of poets and trackers being erased by a famine that Torvian Night Rain's stored riches could end in a single afternoon. That desperation was her armor. It was the only thing that kept her fingers steady as she reached the heavy iron grate overlooking the unreachable vault. Below her lay a chamber of impossible proportions, bathed in the eerie bioluminescent glow of moon lilies that grew in the cracks of the floor. Gold was heaped in careless mounds, coins spilling like autumn leaves, but Arvesa didn't look at the currency. Her eyes were locked on the center of the room, where a plinth of obsidian held a crown that seemed to breathe. The crown of thorns. It was a jagged, cruel thing, forged from a metal that shimmered between silver and deep violet. Legends whispered that it held the collective soul of the first alphas, a conduit of power that could command the very earth to yield grain or the seas to retreat. To Torvian it was a symbol of his absolute sovereignty. To Arvesa, it was the only bargaining chip left in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. She lowered herself on a silken cord, her boots making no sound as they touched the marble floor. The silence in the vault was absolute, yet it felt heavy as if the air itself were weighted with the king's authority. She bypassed the traps, the pressure plates she had memorized from stolen blueprints, the tripwires of silver thread, until she stood before the plinth. Up close, the crown was terrifyingly beautiful. It vibrated with a low subaudible hum that she felt in her marrow. Her hand reached out, trembling. She thought of the Moonthorn elders, their voices cracking as they sang the old songs to keep the cold away. She thought of the empty grain silos and the winter that was coming to finish them off. For them, she whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. Her fingers closed around the cold metal. The moment she lifted it, the world changed. The hum erupted into a roar of ancient memories. The smell of blood, the heat of 1,000 fires, the howl of a wolf that could swallow the moon. It was a heartbeat ancient and possessive, and it slammed into her chest with the force of a physical blow. Arvessa gasped, clutching the crown to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She turned to flee, but the shadows at the edge of the vault began to thicken. They didn't just darken. They coiled, swirling together into a mass of darkness that felt more solid than the stone walls. Then came the sound that froze her blood, a low vibrational growl that seemed to come from the floor itself. From the darkness emerged a beast of nightmares. It was a wolf, but of a size that defied nature, its fur a deep burnt russet that looked like dried blood under the moonlight. Its eyes were twin embers of molten amber, glowing with an intelligence that was far from animal. This was no mere shifter. This was the Alpha King in his most primal state. The massive wolf moved with a terrifying, predatory slowness, his paws making a soft thump-thump on the marble that echoed like a funeral drum. Arvessa backed away until her spine hit the obsidian plinth, the crown's jagged edges digging into her arms. She was trapped. The wolf didn't lung, he simply watched her, his head tilted as if inspecting a curious insect. The sheer power radiating from him was suffocating, a physical weight that demanded she kneel. Arvessa's breath hitched, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a strange, harrowing awe. She had expected guards, arrows, or a quick death. She had not expected him. The wolf took one final step, his snout inches from her face, his hot, carnivorous breath smelling of ozone and ancient woods. Then the air shimmered. The russet fur retreated into skin. The massive frame condensed and straightened. In the blink of an eye, the beast was gone, replaced by a man of devastating, sharp elegance. Torvian Nightrain stood before her, his obsidian hair falling over eyes that remained amber, burning with a possessive fire. He was shirtless, his bronze skin marked with the silver scars of 100 battles, and his presence was even more overwhelming than the wolf's. "You have a very delicate touch for a thief, Arvessa Moonthorn," he said, his voice a velvet trap that vibrated in the small space between them. He didn't reach for the crown. He didn't call the guards. He simply leaned in, his gaze tracking the frantic pulse in her neck, a slow, dark smile spreading across his face. "Keep it," he whispered, the command shivering through her. "But know this, the gold is bound to the king. If you take the crown, you take the man who wears it. Forever." Arvessa looked into his eyes and realized with a jolt of pure, soul-deep terror that she hadn't just stolen a treasure. She had walked right into a cage that had been waiting for her since the dawn of time. The silence in the vault was no longer empty. It was thick with the scent of pine, ozone, and the predatory musk of the man standing inches from Arvessa's throat. Torvian Nightrain did not move to reclaim the crown of thorns. Instead, he watched the frantic rise and fall of her chest with a terrifying, clinical fascination. The jagged gold in Arvessa's hands felt heavier now, as if the metal were drinking the heat from her palms. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and defiant even as her knees threatened to buckle under the sheer weight of his presence. She had prepared for the bite of a blade, for the cold iron of shackles, or the swift snap of a neck. She had not prepared for the way he looked at her, not as a criminal but as a long-awaited prize. "My guards would have you flayed before the moon sets," Torvian said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. He stepped into her personal space, the heat radiating from his bare, scarred chest clashing with the tomb-like chill of the vault. He reached out not for the crown, but for a stray lock of her copper hair, twisting it slowly around a calloused finger. "The Moonthorns have always been a desperate lot, but I did not think they were suicidal. Tell me, little thief, did they send you here to die, or did you choose this martyrdom yourself?" Arvessa found her voice, though it was thin and brittle. "They didn't send me. I came because I won't watch my sisters turn into skeletons while you hoard enough gold to pave the continent. Kill me if you must, but send the grain. That was the bargain I made with myself." Torvian chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. "I have no interest in your death, Arvessa. A corpse cannot wear a crown and a ghost cannot warm a bed." He withdrew his hand, turning away to pace the small circle of light beneath the high, barred window. "Execution is a waste of a rare resource. You have the scent of the old blood on you, the kind of lineage that hasn't been seen in the Moonthorn Valley for 3 centuries. That is why the crown didn't burn your hands to ash the moment you touched it. You didn't just steal a relic. You proved you are the only woman alive capable of surviving it." He stopped and turned, his obsidian eyes flashing with a sudden, predatory hunger. I will not give you a noose. I will give you a contract. You will marry me. You will bind your soul to the night rain line, and in exchange your pack will be fed. I will send wagons of grain, healers for your sick, and soldiers to protect your borders until the end of time. The Moonthorn name will be restored to glory, but it will be a name that serves the king. The words hit Arvessa like a physical blow, more violent than any strike. Marriage. A blood bond with the man whose ancestors had driven hers into the dirt. It was a sentence of eternal captivity disguised as a rescue. To accept meant a slow death of the soul, the end of her freedom, her identity, and her hope of ever truly belonging to herself again. She looked at the crown in her hands, its thorns glinting like bared teeth. If she refused, she would die here and her pack would follow her into the grave within the month. If she accepted, she would become a ghost in a gilded cage, a puppet queen for a monster. You want a thief for a queen? She whispered, her heart aching with the realization that there was no third path. I want a woman who has the fire to rob a god, Torvian countered, stepping back toward her. The court is a den of vipers, Arvessa. I don't need a soft, high-born flower. I need a wolf who knows how to bite. The internal agony was a searing heat in her gut. She thought of her younger sister's hollow cheeks, the way the girl's ribs had felt like a bird's wings when they last hugged. She thought of the silence in their village, the silence of people too tired to speak, too hungry to dream. To save them she had to die. Not the quick death of the sword, but the agonizingly slow death of Arvessa the scavenger, the girl who loved the wind and the wild, unmapped woods. She would have to bury her heart beneath the floorboards of this citadel and become whatever Torvian required. Do it, she said, her voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. Send the grain tonight. If I see the wagons leave the gate, I am yours. Torvian's smile was a terrifying thing to behold, sharp, triumphant, and utterly possessive. He didn't wait for a priest or a witness. In the world of the shifters, blood was the only witness that mattered. He drew a small obsidian dagger from a sheath at his thigh, its blade blacker than the shadows surrounding them. Kneel, he commanded. Arvessa sank to the marble, her silk-clad knees hitting the cold stone. Torvian knelt before her, their faces inches apart. The air felt charged with static, the ancient magic of the vault waking up to witness the pact. He took her right hand in his grip like iron wrapped in velvet. With a swift, practiced motion he drew the blade across her palm. Arvessa didn't flinch, though the sting was sharp. Then he did the same to his own palm, the dark, rich blood welling up instantly. By the bone and the marrow, Torvian intoned, his voice dropping an octave as the power began to swirl around them. By the moon that watches and the earth that hides. I bind your breath to mine, your fate to my throne, and your blood to my line. He pressed his palm against hers. The contact was an explosion. It wasn't just physical touch. It was an invasion. Arvessa gasped as a torrent of fire raced up her arm and slammed into her heart. She saw flashes of his memories, the loneliness of the heights, the scent of 1,000 kills, the crushing weight of a crown he had worn since he was a boy. She felt his hunger for her, a dark, bottomless pit of need that made her tremble. The magical bond stitched their souls together, weaving gold and shadow until she could no longer tell where her heartbeat ended and his began. The crown on the plinth flared with a blinding violet light, acknowledging the union. Arvessa felt a phantom weight settle onto her brow, a heavy, invisible pressure that marked her as his. When Torvian finally pulled his hand away, the wounds on their palms were already closing, leaving behind identical, jagged scars in the shape of a thorn. Torvian stood, pulling her up with him. He didn't let go of her hand. He looked down at her, his eyes no longer just obsidian but flecked with the copper of her own. It is done, he whispered, his thumb brushing over her new scar. You are Arvessa Nightrain now. The grain is already being loaded. You saved them, my queen. But now you belong to the shadows. Arvessa looked toward the high window, where the first light of dawn was beginning to bleed through the gray rain. Her pack would live. Her sisters would eat. But as she looked at the beautiful, terrifying man who now owned her soul, she realized the heist had never truly ended. She had just traded a small treasure for a cage made of blood and gold. The transition from the lightless tunnels of the vault to the blinding, suffocating opulence of the royal court was a violence all its own. Arvessa walked a half-step behind Torvian, her feet clad in slippers of softest doeskin that felt like an insult to the callous soles she had earned on the mountain paths. The heavy silk of her gown, the color of a bruised pomegranate, clung to her skin, weighed down by intricate embroidery of silver thread that mimicked the jagged thorns of the crown she had tried to steal. Every rustle of the fabric felt like a shackle clinking. She felt exposed, a raw nerve stripped of its protective layers and paraded before a gallery of predators. The great hall of the Night Rain Citadel was a cavernous expanse of black marble and white bone, lit by massive chandeliers that dripped with enchanted crystals. As the heavy oak doors groaned open, the ambient roar of conversation died instantly, replaced by a silence so sharp it felt like it could draw blood. Hundreds of pairs of eyes, amber, pale blue and predatory gold, turned toward her. These were the High Alphas, the lords of the northern territories and the jagged peaks, men and women who carried the scent of ancient forests and old money. To them, Arvessa was not a savior or a bride. She was a scent on the wind that didn't belong, a scavenger who had dared to crawl into the eagle's nest. So the rumors are true, a voice drawled, cutting through the silence like a rusted blade. A tall, spindly lord with hair the color of frost stepped forward, his lip curling in a sneer that reached his pale, watery eyes. The king has replaced his treasury guards with a nursery made from the mud flats. Or is she merely a new pet Torvian? I hadn't realized the crown was being handed out as a collar for strays these days. A ripple of cruel, low-timbered laughter echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Arvessa felt the heat crawl up her neck, a mixture of shame and the old, sharp moonthorn rage. She tightened her grip on the folds of her skirt, her knuckles white. She was used to being looked down upon by the elements, by the hunger and by the cold, but the calculated disdain of these pampered wolves was a different kind of frost. They looked at her and saw the dirt beneath her fingernails, the desperation of her pack and the audacity of her survival. Torvian did not stop walking. He didn't even slow his pace. He moved with a terrifying fluid lethargy, his presence expanding to fill the vacuum of the room. The air around him seemed to grow colder, the shadows beneath the chandeliers stretching toward him as if pulled by a magnetic force. When he reached the center of the hall, he finally came to a halt, but he didn't look at the lord who had spoken. He didn't look at the court at all. He turned toward Arvessa, his movements slow and deliberate, and reached out to catch her chin in his hand. His touch was a brand, the scar on his palm humming against her own skin through the invisible link of the blood bond. He tilted her head back, forcing her to look into the obsidian depths of his eyes, making the entire court wait on his whim. The Moonthorns were kings when your ancestors were still licking the marrow from scavenged bones, Lord Varric, Torvian said, his voice quiet, yet it carried to every corner of the hall with the weight of a falling mountain. He didn't raise his tone, yet the lord who had spoken visibly flinched, his bravado evaporating. Torvian's thumb traced the line of Arvessa's jaw, a gesture that was both a caress and a claim. This woman did not ask for my mercy. She walked into my vault, bypassed my wards and laid hands on the sovereignty of this kingdom. She took what she wanted because she had the strength to claim it. He turned then, his gaze sweeping over the gathered nobility like a scythe. The temperature in the room plummeted. Arvessa saw the way the High Alphas lowered their heads, their predatory instincts screaming at them to submit to the dominant male. She is not a guest, Torvian declared, his hand moving from her chin to rest heavily, possessively on the nape of her neck. His fingers tangled in her hair, pulling her slightly closer to his side until her shoulder pressed against his chest. She is the Night Rain Queen. She is the blood of my blood and the shadow to my soul. If any among you finds her lineage lacking, you may take it up with me. But know this, to look at her with anything less than the reverence you owe your king is to invite the wolf to your throat. He let the threat hang in the air, thick and suffocating. To emphasize his point, a low, guttural snarl vibrated in his chest, a sound that was not human, a remnant of the beast that lived just beneath his skin. Arvessa felt the vibration in her own bones, the sheer raw power of his protection wrapping around her like a cloak of iron. It was terrifying, yes, but for the first time in her life she felt a strange, forbidden thrill. She was no longer the girl hiding in the shadows. She was the shadow itself, protected by the most dangerous creature in the world. Torvian leaned down, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "Walk tall, Arvessa," he whispered so low only she could hear. "They are afraid of you. They are afraid because I chose a thief over their daughters, and because they know that a woman who can steal a crown is a woman who can steal a world. He stepped forward, his arms sliding around her waist to pull her flush against him, and began to lead her toward the throne of cold stone at the end of the hall. As they passed, the sea of nobles parted like grain before a storm, their eyes averted, their whispers silenced. Arvessa kept her head high, the jagged gold of the crown now feeling less like a weight and more like a weapon. She was in the den of wolves, but for the first time she realized she wasn't just the prey, she was the mate of the alpha, and the throne of cold stone was waiting to be shared. The banquet hall was a cavern of flickering amber light and treacherous shadows, where the clatter of silver against porcelain sounded like the sharpening of daggers. Arvessa sat at the right hand of the king, her spine a rigid line of defiance against the carved obsidian of her chair. Before her lay a feast that could have sustained her entire village for a month. Roasted meats glazed in honey, dark winter berries, and wine the color of fresh arterial blood. Yet every morsel felt like ash in her mouth. Across the long expanse of the table, the court sat in a state of performative grace, their eyes darting toward her with the cold, calculating hunger of wolves waiting for a weakness to bloom. Torvian sat beside her, a silhouette of brooding power. He did not eat, he watched. His obsidian eyes scanned the room, tracing the movement of every servant and the twitch of every noble's hand. He was a sentinel of stone and sinew, his presence a heavy, suffocating weight that kept the room's hidden animosity at bay. The tension was a living thing, coiled and ready to strike, and it finally found its opening when a young page, his hands trembling almost imperceptibly, poured a deep violet vintage into Arvessa's chalice. The wine swirled, catching the light of the chandeliers. Arvessa reached for the glass, her fingers mere inches from the rim, when the air suddenly turned frigid. Torvian's hand shot out, his fingers clamping around her wrist with the force of a tectonic shift. The suddenness of the movement sent a ripple of silence through the hall. Arvessa looked at him, her heart hammering against her ribs, but his gaze wasn't on her. It was fixed on the liquid in the glass. A rare vintage, Torvian remarked, his voice a deceptively soft purr that carried a lethal edge. He picked up the chalice, swirling the wine slowly. Grown in the southern valleys, seasoned with sun and soil. But this has the faint, bitter scent of nightshade root. A clumsy choice for a court that prides itself on its refinement. The page turned the color of parchment, his knees buckling. Before the boy could even stammer a plea, Torvian stood. The movement was so fluid, so predatory, that half the lords at the table instinctively pushed their chairs back in fear. He didn't look at the boy, he looked at Lord Varric who sat 3 seats down, his face a mask of feigned shock. The boy is a vessel, Torvian growled, the sound vibrating through the table making the fine crystal chatter. But the hand that guided him sits among us. In an explosion of movement, Torvian seized the chalice and dashed its contents across the table toward Varric. The wine hissed as it hit the wood, the poison so potent it seemed to dim the light of the candles it touched. Torvian's shift was partial and terrifying. His claws elongated, black and curved like obsidian talons, and his shadow expanded until it draped over the high walls like the wings of a monstrous bird. He bypassed the table in a single blurred leap, pinning Varric against his chair by the throat. The sound of the Lord's windpipe straining under Torvian's grip was the only noise in the room. "You think her a thief?" Torvian hissed, his face inches from Varric's. "She stole from me and I rewarded her with a kingdom. You tried to steal her life and I will reward you with a grave." He didn't kill him, not yet. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed like a death knell. "Look at her. Remember her face. Because she is the only reason I haven't burned your lands to the bedrock. She is my shield and I am her sword. If a single hair on her head is harmed, I will peel the skin from your house until there is nothing left but the screaming." He flung the lord aside like a broken toy and turned back to Arvessa. The court watched in breathless terror as the Alpha King, the monster of the north, walked back to the thief queen. The black claws retracted, and the murderous fire in his eyes dimmed just enough to reveal a raw, jagged possessiveness. He reached out, his hand still trembling with the remnants of his rage, and cupped her cheek. Later, in the suffocating silence of the royal bedchamber, the bravado of the hall evaporated. Arvessa stood by the window, watching the rain lash against the stone, her body finally beginning to shake. The reality of the evening, the wine, the claws, the absolute certainty that she was surrounded by people who wanted her heart on a platter, finally broke through her armor. She heard the heavy thud of the door closing and the soft click of the lock. Torvian was there, his scent of wood smoke and iron filling the room. He didn't approach her with the arrogance of a king. He stood by the hearth, the firelight casting long flickering shadows across his scarred chest. "You're trembling," he said softly. "I'm a thief, Torvian," she whispered, not turning around. "I know how to hide in the dark. I know how to run. I don't know how to be the reason men die. I don't know how to live in a place where the air itself is a weapon." She felt him move behind her, a steady warmth that didn't demand or intrude. He didn't touch her, but he stood close enough that she could feel the thrum of his heartbeat through the blood bond. "I have spent a century being the monster they fear," Torvian said, his voice stripped of its royal artifice. "I have built these walls out of bone and shadow to keep the world away. But tonight when I saw that glass touch your lips, the walls didn't matter. For the first time in my life I felt fear. Not for my crown or my kingdom. For you." Arvessa turned, finding him looking at her with an expression that was almost agonizingly human. The terrifying alpha was gone, replaced by a man who looked exhausted by the weight of his own power. In that moment of genuine vulnerability, the distance between the king and the thief vanished. "You aren't a captive here, Arvessa," he whispered, reaching out to touch the thorn scar on her palm with his own. "You are the only thing in this citadel that isn't made of stone. If you fall, the light goes out of this world." Arvessa looked into his obsidian eyes and saw not a master but a partner in the dark. She reached up, her fingers grazing the silver scars on his shoulder, and for the first time she didn't pull away. The bond between them flared. A low humming warmth that promised that in this den of monsters, they were the only two who truly understood what it meant to be hunted. The heavy chamber doors felt like the seal of a tomb, muffling the distant predatory echoes of the citadel. In the center of the room, perched upon a cushion of midnight velvet, the crown of thorns sat bathed in the pale, sickly light of a waning moon. Since the night of the failed poisoning, Arvessa had looked at the artifact with a mixture of reverence and revulsion. It was the reason she was bound to a king, the reason her pack ate, and the reason she now walked through hallways that felt like the throat of a beast. Torvian was away at the borders, dealing with the unrest her arrival had sparked, leaving her alone with the golden weight of her new reality. Driven by a compulsion she couldn't name, a phantom itch in the marrow of her bones, Arvessa reached for the crown. Her fingers brushed the jagged metal and the room seemed to tilt. The gold was not cold, it was searingly hot, pulsing with a rhythmic thrum that matched the double beat of her own heart. With a breath that hitched in her throat, she lifted the relic and lowered it onto her brow. The world didn't just vanish, it shattered. Arvessa didn't scream, she couldn't. Her lungs were suddenly filled with the scent of ancient wood smoke and the copper tang of a battlefield that had been cold for 1,000 years. Visions tore through her mind with the violence of a physical assault. She saw the sky turn the color of a fresh bruise as two suns rose over a landscape she recognized as her own valley, but it was lush, vibrant, and teeming with life. She saw shifters not as warring packs, but as a unified legion, their forms fluid and terrifying as they fought against a creeping, formless shadow that sought to turn the world into a silent wasteland. She felt the collective agony of the first alphas as they poured their life force into the crown, forging it as a key to a gate that kept the darkness at bay. But more chilling than the war was the face that appeared in the swirling mist of her vision. It was a woman with copper hair and eyes of molten amber, a mirror image of herself, standing beside a Shadow King who bore Torvian's exact lethal grace. The crown was the bridge and the blood was the toll. The vision whispered a truth that made her soul recoil. The famine, the decay of the Moonthorn lands, and the rise of the Night Rain power were not accidents of history. They were the slow, agonizing preparation for the Shadow's return. The crown fell from her head, clattering onto the stone floor with a sound like a dying bell. Arvessa collapsed, gasping for air, her skin slick with a cold sweat that felt like ice. "It is quite a burden, isn't it?" The voice was low, smooth, and came from the darkest corner of the room. Torvian stepped out of the shadows, his travel-worn cloak still damp with the mountain mist. He didn't look surprised to see her on the floor or the crown discarded like a piece of refuse. He looked at her with an expression of profound, terrifying clarity. Arvessa scrambled back, her eyes wide as she stared at him. You knew, she whispered, the realization cutting deeper than any blade. The vault. The security that was supposed to be impenetrable. You didn't just let me in. You lured me. Torvian walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. He knelt, picking up the crown with a familiarity that spoke of a lifetime of shared pain. The crown of thorns only accepts those who possess the old blood, the specific resonance of the Moonthorn lineage. For 300 years, my family has held this relic, waiting for a daughter of the valley to grow strong enough to try and take it. Many tried. Most were consumed by the first touch. He leaned in, his obsidian eyes searching hers. I didn't just want a thief, Arvessa. I needed a survivor whose genetics could unlock the seal. Your desperation was the catalyst. Your willingness to die for your pack was the proof that the fire in your blood hadn't gone out. The betrayal tasted like copper in her mouth. Every touch, every protective growl, every moment of vulnerability in the hall, it had all been a test. She wasn't his queen, she was his missing component. A biological key to a cosmic lock. So this marriage, the blood bond. Arvessa's voice trembled with a mixture of hurt and fury. It was just a way to ensure the compatibility? To make sure I was bound to the machine before you turned the key? Torvian reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before he pulled it back. A flicker of something that looked dangerously like regret crossing his features. It started as a necessity for the survival of our kind. The war you saw isn't over, Arvessa. It's just been sleeping. But the bond. He paused, his voice dropping to a raw, jagged whisper. The bond is real. I might have hunted you for your blood, but I find myself captivated by the woman who carries it. You think I'm a monster for testing you? Perhaps. But I am a monster who now cannot breathe without the sound of your heart echoing in my own. Arvessa looked at the crown in his hands and then at the man who had orchestrated her destiny. She was a moonthorn, a creature of the wild, and she had been trapped by a king who needed her more than he loved her. Or perhaps, in his twisted, predatory world, those two things were exactly the same. The betrayal of the crown's secret lingered in the air like the scent of ozone after a lightning strike, leaving Arvessa's soul feeling frayed and exposed. If she was merely a biological key, a vessel for ancient genetics, then every moment of tenderness in the Citadel was a calculated move in a grander game. The doubt gnawed at her, a persistent tooth in the dark, until she could no longer stand the gilded suffocation of the royal chambers. She needed to see the faces of those she had sold herself to save. She needed to know if the price she was paying, this slow dissolution of her identity, was bearing fruit in the mud and cold of the Moonthorn Valley. Under the shroud of a moonless midnight, Arvessa reverted to the woman she had been before the gold touched her brow. She shed the heavy silks for a tunic of boiled leather and rough wool, slipping through the secret egresses of the Citadel with the practiced invisibility of a shadow. The blood bond hummed in her veins, a low-frequency tether that pulled toward the center of the fortress where Torvian slept, but she pushed against it, forcing her legs to carry her down the jagged cliffs and toward the encampments on the outskirts of the Iron Ridge. The wind bit at her skin, a familiar harsh greeting from the wild lands she had called home. She expected to find the usual scenes of misery, huddled masses shivering under threadbare tents, the sound of hollow coughing and the desperate silence of the dying. But as she crested the final ridge overlooking the Moonthorn camp, the sight that met her eyes stole the breath from her lungs. The valley was not dark. It was alive with the warm amber glow of cook fires and sturdy newly constructed timber longhouses. The smell that drifted on the wind was not the rot of famine, but the intoxicating aroma of baking bread and salted venison. Arvessa crept closer, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. She saw her people, men who had been too weak to stand a week ago now hauling logs with renewed vigor, and children with cheeks that were beginning to lose their sunken, ghostly pallor. She found her sister, Elara, sitting by a hearth that roared with plenty. The girl was wrapped in a cloak of thick wolf fur, laughing as she shared a bowl of thick stew with a companion. Arvessa watched from the darkness, a sob catching in her throat. The grain had not just been sent. It had been accompanied by healers, engineers, and a level of care that went far beyond the cold requirements of a political contract. Torvian hadn't just fulfilled the bargain. He had exceeded it with a silent, pervasive generosity that he had never mentioned to her. A shadow shifted behind her, and the air grew warm with a scent she knew as well as her own. She didn't turn. He didn't need to. The predator was here, but he wasn't hunting. I didn't do it for the bloodline, Torvian said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to anchor her to the earth. He stood a few paces back, his silhouette blending into the ancient oaks. I did it because you asked. And because I realized that if I wanted the queen to stay, the thief had to know her people were safe. Arvessa finally turned, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. The anger she had nursed since the discovery of the crown's secrets began to crumble, replaced by a confusing, aching warmth. She saw him then, not the Alpha King of the legends, not the monster who claimed her by force, but a man who understood the crushing weight of responsibility. He was looking at her pack not as assets but as hers. And because they were hers, they were his to protect. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered, her voice cracking. Why let me believe you were just a cold master of the vault? Torvian stepped forward, the starlight catching the silver of his scars and the weary honesty in his obsidian eyes. Because I am a creature of shadows, Arvessa. I find it easier to act than to explain. Kindness is a language I am still learning to speak without an accent of iron. He reached out, his hand stopping just short of her face, waiting for her permission. Arvessa took the final step herself, leaning her cheek into his calloused palm. The shift in her heart was seismic. She saw the man behind the monster, a ruler who was as much a prisoner of his duty as she was of her fate, and who chose to use his power to mend what was broken. In the quiet of the valley, surrounded by the life he had restored, Arvessa realized she wasn't just his key. She was starting to become his heart, and for the first time the cage didn't feel like a prison. It felt like home. The winter solstice had arrived, bringing with it a cold so profound it seemed to turn the very breath of the citadel into shards of diamonds. In the great hall, the transformation was total. The black marble was draped in furs the color of moonlight, and the air was thick with the scent of crushed pine and expensive imported resins. This was the night of the High Alpha's judgment, the social apex where the Queen of Thieves was expected to falter, to reveal the common dirt beneath her royal masquerade. Arvessa stood before the tall looking-glass in her chambers, her heart a frantic drum beneath a bodice of midnight velvet so dark it seemed to swallow the candlelight. The crown of thorns rested upon her brow, no longer a foreign weight, but a part of her anatomy, its jagged peaks catching the light with a predatory shimmer. She was no longer the girl who scavenged for scraps. She was a woman forged in the crucible of a king's obsession, and tonight she would have to be more dangerous than the wolves who waited for her below. The doors to her chamber groaned open and Torvian entered, his presence a silent roar that demanded the very air retreat. He was dressed in charcoal silk and silver mail, his obsidian hair swept back to reveal the sharp, aristocratic lines of a face built for war. He stopped several paces behind her, his reflection overlapping hers in the silvered glass. For a long moment he simply looked at her, his amber eyes burning with a pride that bordered on worship. He reached out, his hand gloved in black leather, and let his fingers trail over the curve of her shoulder, a touch that sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity through the blood bond. They are waiting to see a thief stumble, he whispered, his voice a velvet promise of violence. They are waiting for a girl who got lucky. Give them the queen who stole the heart of the north instead. When they descended the grand staircase, the roar of the ballroom died as if a throat had been cut. Arvessa didn't look at the floor. She kept her chin high, her gaze sweeping over the sea of cynical nobles with a cool, detached sovereignty that she had learned from the man at her side. She felt the weight of their judgment, the acidic whispers of the high alphas who still saw her as a low-born intruder, but she also felt the heat of Torvian's arm around her waist, a physical anchor in a storm of hostility. They reached the center of the floor just as the orchestra struck the first heavy rhythmic chords of the Valenstrun, the dance of the Great Hunt. It was a traditional display of dominance and courtship, a ritual where the alphas moved with the lethal grace of their beast forms, testing the strength and resolve of their partners. Torvian turned to her, offering his hand. There was no hesitation in her movement as she placed her palm against his. The moment their skin met, the ballroom vanished. The chemistry between them, which had been a slow-simmering fire since the night of the heist, erupted into a conflagration. They began to move, a whirlwind of velvet and shadow. Torvian led with a primal, commanding intensity, drawing her into his space until her chest brushed the silver of his tunic. He didn't just dance with her. He hunted her across the floor, his movements mirroring the predatory elegance of the russet wolf. Arvessa met him stride for stride, her body responding to his with an instinctual, terrifying harmony. Every spin, every sharp intake of breath, every lingering gaze was a testament to the bond that now ran deeper than bone. As the tempo accelerated, the physical world blurred into a kaleidoscope of flickering candlelight and the scent of iron and roses. Arvessa felt the power of the crown pulsing on her brow, humming in sympathy with the man who held her. She saw the shock on the faces of the court, the realization that she wasn't just surviving the dance, she was mastering it. She was the flame to his shadow, the edge to his blade. When Torvian pulled her flush against him for the final crashing chord, the silence that followed was no longer one of disdain, but of breathless awe. Their hearts beat in a frantic, shared rhythm, their faces inches apart, the air between them thick with a longing that was no longer a secret. In that moment the Queen of Thieves had disappeared, replaced by a sovereign who had not only stolen a crown but had conquered the king himself. The triumph of the winter solstice ball was a fragile glass shield, shattered less than an hour after the final dance ended. The air in the citadel, once thick with the scent of celebratory pine, had soured into the metallic tang of betrayal. Torvian had led Arvessa toward the private solar, his hand still possessively anchored to the small of her back, when the shadows of the corridor didn't just flicker, they bled. Lord Varric, the man Torvian had publicly humiliated at the banquet, emerged from the gloom, but he was not alone. He was flanked by the royal chancellor, a man Arvessa had trusted to teach her the lineages of the north, and a dozen silent cloaked figures bearing silver-edged blades designed specifically to pierce alpha hide. The betrayal was instantaneous and surgical. The chancellor, utilizing a key only he possessed, activated the suppression runes embedded in the walls of the private wing. Arvessa felt the change immediately. The humming warmth of the blood bond was suddenly choked, replaced by a cold, hollow vacuum that left her gasping. Torvian let out a guttural roar, his body jerking as he tried to shift, but the runes acted like silver chains around his soul, pinning the beast beneath his skin. In that moment of weakness, Varric lunged. He didn't aim for the heart, he aimed for the crown. The obsidian blade he carried was a relic of the Dark War, a jagged tooth of shadow that sliced through Torvian's protective stance. The king moved to shield Arvessa, taking the blow intended for her throat across his own chest. Blood, dark and steaming in the cold air, splattered across the pomegranate silk of Arvessa's gown. Torvian slumped against the stone wall, his face a mask of gray agony as the poisoned blade did its work. Varric stepped over him, his eyes alight with a manic, grasping greed. "Give it to me, you little scavenger," he hissed, reaching for the crown of thorns resting on Arvessa's head. "It was never meant for a gutter rat. It belongs to those with the sense to use its power, not a king who has gone soft for a thief." For a heartbeat, the old Arvessa, the girl who knew how to survive by disappearing, screamed at her to run. The egress was only 20 feet away. She could vanish into the servants' tunnels, take the crown back to her people, and leave this den of monsters to tear itself apart. She could be free of the gilded cage, the blood bond, and the terrifying weight of Torvian's love. She looked down at the king, the man who had fed her people, who had looked at her with a vulnerability that broke her heart, and who was now dying because he had chosen to be her shield. Arvessa didn't run. She didn't scream. Instead, a cold, ancient fire ignited in her marrow. She reached up not to remove the crown, but to press it more firmly onto her brow. The jagged gold bit into her skin, and as her own blood touched the metal, the suppression runes in the hallway began to scream. She was the thief who had been tested. She was the key that Torvian had sought. And she was done being the prey. "You want the crown?" Arvessa's voice was no longer her own. It was a chorus of 1,000 first alphas, echoing with a resonance that cracked the stone floor. She stepped over Torvian's fallen form, her eyes glowing with a blinding violet light. "Then you will take the thorns that come with it." She didn't use a blade. She used the very air of the citadel, commanding the shadows that Torvian had taught her to respect. The darkness rose like a tidal wave, coiling around Varric and the chancellor, stripping the air from their lungs. Arvessa stood her ground, a queen of shadows and blood, fighting not for a throne, but for the life of the monster who had become her world. In that moment she realized the price of eternal sovereignty wasn't the gold. It was the willingness to burn the world down to protect the one who shared your soul. The violet light emanating from the crown of thorns did not fade as the conspirators fell. It expanded, bleeding through the stone walls of the citadel until the entire fortress pulsed like a living heart. Torvian lay at Arvesa's feet, his breath a ragged, wet rasp, the obsidian poison turning his veins into black lightning beneath his skin. The suppression runes were shattered, but the damage was deep. Arvesa knelt beside him, the pomegranate silk of her skirts soaking up the heavy crimson of his blood. She reached for the bond, that invisible tether she had once considered a leash, and found it frayed and screaming. In the distance, the formless shadow she had seen in her visions, the ancient extinction that threatened all shifter kind, began to claw at the edges of the physical world, drawn by the scent of a dying king. Arvesa, Torvian choked out, his hand clutching her wrist with a strength that was failing. Take the crown, run to the valley. Save yourself. I am not a thief anymore, Torvian, she whispered, her voice steady even as tears tracked through the blood on her cheeks. And I am done running. She didn't just touch his hand, she pressed her forehead against his, closing her eyes and plunging into the depths of the blood bond. She didn't try to pull him back with strength alone. She offered him her own life force, her own fire, and the ancestral memories of the Moonthorn line. She showed him the unity of the two suns she had seen in the vision, the hunter and the seeker, the shadow and the flame. The final battle was not fought with steel in the corridors, but with soul in the ethereal. As the dark entity outside the walls began to manifest, Arvesa and Torvian's consciousness merged into a single blinding entity. The crown on her brow and the blood in his veins recognized the union. The power that erupted from them was a symphony of russet fur and copper light, a shockwave of pure sovereignty that didn't just repel the shadows. It rewrote the ancient laws of their world. The blight on the Moonthorn lands withered and died, replaced by the sudden, miraculous scent of blooming lilies, and the poison in Torvian's blood was incinerated by the heat of their shared heartbeat. When the light finally receded, the citadel was silent, but it was no longer cold. Torvian stood, his wounds closed into silver scars, his eyes reflecting the amber of Arvesa's own. He reached out not to command her but to offer his hand as a partner. Arvesa took it, standing tall as the crown on her head settled with a weight that felt like a caress rather than a burden. She looked out over the balcony at the sunrise, seeing the Moonthorn and Night Rain banners flying side by side. She was no longer a captive of his vault or a pawn of his lineage. She was the Alpha's equal, the architect of a new era. By choosing to bind herself to him, she had unchained them both, ensuring that the blood of the shifter kinds would never run dry. The thief had stolen a kingdom and in its place she had built a home. Thank you for listening to this story. Please comment your thoughts and also tell me where you are watching from. Like and share this story and also subscribe to this channel for more stories every day.